He was a lonely millionaire until he found a woman crying in a park with a baby in her arms. What he did next changed the lives of all three forever. The squeal of tires against asphalt echoed through the empty parking lot of Central Park as Alexander Rothschild parked his silver Aston Martin. It was 5:30 in the morning and the park was practically deserted, just the way he liked it. Silence had been his only reliable companion in recent years. Alexander adjusted his wristwatch, a Patek Philippe valued at over $500,000, and began his morning run. At 42, he was the embodiment of Wall Street success. Gray hair at the temples, a well-defined jaw, and a physique sculpted by years of iron discipline. His fortune was estimated in the billions, but the emptiness in his chest seemed to grow in proportion to his bank account. As he ran, his thoughts wandered through the empty corridors of his penthouse on Park Avenue. Board meetings, mergers and acquisitions. This was how his weeks unfolded, one after the other, in a golden monotony. The power he wielded in the financial world was undeniable. But at what cost? True friends were few, family was a distant concept, and love, well, that was something he had long since stopped believing in. It was then that a sound cut through the morning air, so out of place in that sanctuary of concrete and domesticated nature that Alexander almost stumbled. It was the cry of a baby, followed by muffled sobs. Intrigued and a little irritated by the interruption to his routine, he followed the sound. Turning a bend in the road, Alexander came across a scene that seemed straight out of another world, his world of cold numbers and calculated strategies. Sitting on a worn bench was a young woman, no more than 25, holding a baby wrapped in a threadbare blanket. Her clothes, although clean, were clearly worn, and her posture was one of pure desperation. Alexander hesitated. His first reaction was to turn around and continue running. After all, other people's problems were not his responsibility. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the vulnerability of the scene, or perhaps it was a distant echo of his own humanity, so long suffocated by the relentless pace of Wall Street. "Is everything all right?" The words were out of his mouth before he could stop them. The woman lifted her face, revealing watery green eyes and a face that, despite the obvious fatigue, possessed an ethereal beauty. For a moment, she looked frightened, hugging the baby tighter to her chest. We're fine," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "We just needed some fresh air." Alexander knew a lie when he heard one. It was an essential skill in his world. But this wasn't a malicious lie. It was the kind of lie people tell when they're on the edge, when admitting the truth would be admitting defeat. "Can I sit down?" he asked, indicating the empty space on the bench. The woman hesitated for a moment before nodding silently. Alexander sat down, keeping a respectful distance. "My name is Alexander," he introduced himself, his voice softer than usual. "Sophie," she replied after a pause, "and this is Noah." The baby, as if recognizing his name, let out a little sigh and snuggled closer into his mother's lap. Have you been here long?" Alexander asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Sophie bit her lip, clearly debating how much to reveal. "A few hours," she finally admitted. "We had nowhere to go, and Her voice faltered, and Alexander saw the tears she had been struggling to hold back finally spill over. It was at that moment that something inside him broke, or perhaps finally healed. "Sophie," he said softly, "I know you don't know me, and you have every right not to trust me. But I'd like to help, if you'll let me." She looked at him, a mixture of hope and fear in her eyes. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know me. You don't know our history." Alexander took a deep breath, surprising himself with the honesty of his next words. "Because looking at you two, I see something I lost a long time ago, the chance to make a difference. Not with money or power, but with compassion." Sophie studied him for a long moment, as if trying to read his soul. Whatever she saw seemed to convince her, as she nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, her voice gaining a little strength. "What do you suggest?" Alexander stood up, holding out a hand to her. "First, let's get out of this cold. I know a cafe nearby that serves a great breakfast. We can talk and see how I can help." Sophie hesitated for a second before accepting the outstretched hand, standing up with Noah safe in her arms. As they walked together out of the park, Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced for years: the warmth of hope. The sun was beginning to rise over Manhattan, casting a golden light over the unlikely trio. It was a new day, not only for Sophie and Noah, but also for Alexander. As they crossed the street towards the cafe, he couldn't help thinking that maybe, just maybe, this unexpected encounter was the start of something extraordinary. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and freshly baked bread enveloped Sophie as soon as she entered the cozy establishment. The Sunrise Cafe was a stark contrast to the cold park bench where she had spent the last few hours. Her eyes roamed around, noticing the polished wooden tables, the plants hanging from the ceiling, and the soft jazz music that filled the air. Alexander gently guided Sophie to a discreet table at the back, away from the prying eyes of the few early morning customers. As they settled down, Noah wriggled restlessly in Sophie's arms, his little eyes opening to his new surroundings. "Good morning, Mr. Rothschild." The usual. A middle-aged waitress with a warm smile approached the table. "Good morning, Doris. Not today. Could you bring us the menu, please?" Alexander replied with a polite smile. Sophie watched the interaction with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Who exactly was this man who had brought her to a cafe where he was clearly a regular? "Sophie," Alexander began, his voice soft, "please order whatever you want. You and Noah must be hungry." She hesitated, her eyes scanning the menu with prices that, in other circumstances, would have made her recoil. Maybe just a coffee and toast?" Alexander frowned slightly. "Sophie, I know we haven't met, but I can see that you and Noah need a proper meal. Please don't worry about the cost." Something in the gentleness of his voice made Sophie's defenses drop a little. She nodded, ordering a latte, scrambled eggs, fresh fruit, and a bowl of porridge for Noah. While they waited for their food, an uncomfortable silence hung over the table. Sophie settled Noah on her lap, avoiding Alexander's gaze. "Sophie," Alexander finally broke the silence, "I understand if you don't want to share, but what happened? How did you and Noah end up on that park bench?" Sophie took a deep breath, her fingers playing nervously with the edge of the table. For a moment, Alexander thought she wouldn't answer, but then she began to speak, her voice low and shaky. I was an art student at NYU. I had big dreams, you know. But then I met Jack. He was charming, attentive, at least at first." She paused, swallowing. "When I got pregnant, everything changed. Jack became controlling, then violent. I put up with it for a long time, thinking it was for Noah's sake. But last night," his voice faltered. Alexander felt a wave of anger rise up inside him, but he kept his expression neutral, not wanting to frighten Sophie. "Last night, he came home drunk, angrier than ever. I knew that if we stayed, he could hurt Noah, so I waited until he passed out and ran away. I took only what I could carry and went out into the night. We ended up in that bank because I had nowhere else to go." Sophie's words hung in the air, heavy and painful. Alexander felt his heart squeeze. How could anyone treat someone they were supposed to love and protect like that? "Sophie," he said softly, "you did the right thing. Protecting Noah and yourself is the most important thing now." Just then, Doris arrived with the food. The delicious aroma seemed to break the tension a little, and Sophie, after a moment's hesitation, began to eat greedily. Alexander watched in silence as she alternated between feeding herself and giving spoonfuls of porridge to Noah. "Alexander," Sophie said after a few minutes, her voice a little stronger, "why are you doing this? Why are you helping me?" Alexander pondered the question for a moment, his eyes fixed on the cup of coffee in front of him. "Honestly, I don't know exactly. Maybe because, looking at you and Noah, I saw an opportunity to do something truly meaningful for the first time in years." He looked up, meeting Sophie's curious gaze. "I've spent the last 15 years building a financial empire. I have more money than I could spend in several lifetimes, but—" He paused, surprised at his own vulnerability. "But I have no one to share it with. No real connection. Seeing you and Noah on that bench, it was like a slap in the face, a reminder of what really matters in life." Sophie studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decipher a complex puzzle. "You look lonely," she finally said, her voice soft. Alexander laughed humorlessly. "I think that's a good description, but this isn't about me. Sophie, I want to help you and Noah, not just with a meal, but really help. Do you have somewhere to stay?" Sophie shook her head, her eyes downcast. "No, I didn't think much beyond running away." Alexander nodded, a decision forming in his mind. "I have an empty apartment on the Upper East Side. It was my grandmother's, but it's been unoccupied for years. If you want, you can stay there until you settle in. No strings attached, just a safe place for you and Noah." Sophie's eyes widened in shock. "Alexander, I can't accept this. It's too much." "Sophie," Alexander said, leaning forward, "I know it sounds crazy. We barely know each other. But please, think of Noah. You both deserve a safe place, and I have the means to provide that. Let me help." Sophie looked down at Noah, who was now sleeping peacefully in her arms, a smudge of porridge in the corner of his little mouth. She seemed to be fighting an internal battle, weighing up the risks against her desperate need for security. Finally, she raised her eyes, a newfound determination shining in her gaze. "Okay," she said softly. "We accept, but on one condition." Alexander arched an eyebrow, curious. "What would that be?" "You can't just give us the keys and disappear," Sophie said, her voice gaining strength. "If we're going to do that, I want to get to know you, understand why you're doing this, and maybe we can help each other." A genuine smile, the first in years, spread across Alexander's face. "Sounds fair," he said, holding out his hand. "Do we have a deal?" Sophie looked at his outstretched hand for a moment before shaking it firmly. "We have a deal." As they left the cafe, the New York sun shone brighter, as if approving of the unlikely alliance that had just formed. Alexander didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt truly alive. Sophie and Noah had inadvertently opened a door in his heart that he thought would be locked forever. As they walked towards their car, Alexander made a silent promise to himself. He would do everything in his power to protect Sophie and Noah, not just for them, but also for the part of himself that was slowly awakening to life again. The elevator rose silently through the floors of the elegant Art Deco building on East 78th Street. Sophie held Noah tightly against her chest, her wide eyes reflecting a mixture of anxiety and disbelief. Alexander, beside her, maintained a calm expression. But inside, his heart was racing. What was he doing? Inviting strangers to live in one of his apartments? It was madness. And yet, something inside him insisted that it was the right thing to do. With a soft ding, the doors opened directly into the apartment's entrance hall. Sophie choked audibly as she entered. The space was large and airy, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of Central Park. Antique furniture, clearly valuable, blended harmoniously with more modern pieces. It's amazing," Sophie murmured, turning slowly to take it all in. Noah, sensing his mother's excitement, let out a happy gurgle. Alexander watched their reaction with a mixture of satisfaction and strange discomfort. "It was my grandmother's apartment," he explained, his voice soft. "She loved it here. She said she could feel the pulse of the city from here." Sophie turned to him, her eyes meeting his. "Alexander, this is too much. I can't—" "You can," he interrupted her gently. "And you will. Sophie, you and Noah need somewhere safe. This apartment has been empty for too long. It would be nice to see it full of life again." Something in his voice, a vulnerability she hadn't expected, made Sophie hesitate. Slowly, she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. We don't know how to thank you." Alexander smiled, a gesture that lit up his usually serious face. "No need to thank me. Just make good use of this place. And remember our condition." Sophie frowned, confused for a moment, before remembering. "Ah, yes, getting to know you. Understand why you're doing this." "Exactly," Alexander agreed. "How about we start now? Can I order something for lunch and we can talk?" An hour later, they were sitting in the spacious living room, leftovers from an Italian meal spread out on the coffee table. Noah was sleeping peacefully in a makeshift crib made of soft cushions. "So," Sophie began, her voice more confident than it had been all morning, "tell me about Alexander Rothschild. Who's the man behind the expensive suit?" Alexander laughed softly, fingering the rim of his water glass. "Honestly, sometimes I wonder myself." He paused, as if organizing his thoughts. "The short version? I'm the CEO of Rothschild Investments. I built the company from scratch, turning it into one of the biggest fund managers on Wall Street." Sophie nodded slowly. "That explains all of it." She gestured around. "But it doesn't explain why you decided to help a stranger and her baby." Alexander sighed, leaning back on the sofa. "You're right. The truth is, I lost something along the way, Sophie. I lost connection with people, with what really matters. Seeing you and Noah on that bench, it was like an alarm clock, a reminder of what I left behind in my quest for success." Sophie studied him for a long moment. "Don't you have a family?" The question, although simple, hit Alexander like a punch in the gut. "No," he replied softly. "My parents died when I was young. I was brought up by my grandmother, but she passed away a few years ago. Since then, well, it's just been me and the company." A heavy silence fell over them, broken only by the soft sounds of Noah sleeping. "I'm sorry," Sophie finally said. "It must be lonely." Alexander shrugged, trying to look indifferent, but Sophie could see the pain in his eyes. "It's the price of success, I guess. But enough about me. What about you, Sophie? Apart from what you told me at the cafe, who are you?" Sophie smiled sadly. "Well, as I said, I was an art student. I always dreamed of being a painter, creating beauty in the world." She paused, looking down at her hands. "But then I met Jack, got pregnant, and, well, the dreams took a back seat." "They don't have to," Alexander said softly. Sophie looked up in surprise. "This apartment has a room that my grandmother used as a studio. It's full of painting materials. I'm sure she'd love to know that it's being used again." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "Alexander, I don't know what to say." Just then, Noah woke up, his cries filling the apartment. Sophie immediately got up to pick him up, but hesitated, looking at Alexander. Can I show him the apartment?" Alexander smiled, feeling a wave of warmth spread through his chest. "Of course, it's your home now." As Sophie walked around the apartment, murmuring softly to Noah, Alexander watched them, a strange, comforting feeling settling in his heart. It was as if, for the first time in years, he was really home. Hours passed, and the sun began to set, painting the New York sky in shades of orange and pink. Alexander knew he had to go, but something kept him there, reluctant to leave the bubble of warmth and connection that had formed. "Sophie," he finally said, "I have to go, but first, there's something I'd like to propose." Sophie, who was cradling Noah by the window, turned to him, curious. "I know you need time to settle in, to feel safe, but when you're ready, I'd like to offer you a job." Sophie's eyes widened. "A job? But I have no experience in finance or—" Alexander laughed. "Not at the company. Here, in this building. My grandmother used to organize charity events, art exhibitions. She was a great patron of the arts. I'd like to take that up again, and I think you'd be perfect to help." Sophie was silent for a moment, processing the offer. I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything now," Alexander replied gently. "Think about it. Talk to Noah," he added with a playful smile, making Sophie laugh. As he prepared to leave, Alexander felt an uncharacteristic hesitation. "Sophie, Can I come back tomorrow to see how you're settling in?" The smile Sophie gave him was like a ray of sunshine after a long storm. "We'd love that." As he walked out of the building and into the New York night, Alexander felt different, lighter, perhaps, or maybe just more human. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he was looking forward to finding out. Meanwhile, in the apartment above, Sophie looked out of the window, Noah nestled in her arms. "Look at that, my love," she whispered. "Looks like we've found our guardian angel." The following weeks passed like a whirlwind for Sophie and Noah. The apartment, once a symbol of untouchable luxury, quickly turned into a cozy home. The once silent corridors now echoed with Noah's laughter and Sophie's soft lullabies. Alexander, true to his word, visited regularly. At first, his visits were brief and somewhat awkward, as if he didn't quite know how to fit into this new world he had created. But gradually, as the days turned into weeks, something began to change. One sunny Saturday afternoon, Alexander arrived carrying a mysterious box. Sophie, who was on the living room floor playing with Noah, looked up curiously. "What have you got there?" she asked, a smile playing on her lips. Alexander carefully placed the box on the floor. "Something I found in the company warehouse. I thought Noah might like it." With a theatrical flourish, he opened the box, revealing a beautifully preserved old wooden train. Noah's eyes lit up, and he immediately crawled towards the toy, squealing with delight. Sophie watched in amazement as Alexander sat on the floor next to Noah, patiently showing him how to assemble the rails and make the train move. It was a scene she would never have imagined weeks ago. The powerful Wall Street tycoon, still dressed in his impeccable suit, sitting on the carpet playing with a baby. "You're good at that," Sophie commented softly. Alexander looked up, a light blush coloring his cheeks. "It's easier than negotiating mergers and acquisitions," he joked, but there was a note of vulnerability in his voice. While Noah happily played with his new treasure, Sophie and Alexander moved to the sofa, watching the little one with identical smiles. "How are you feeling?" Alexander asked, his voice gentle. "About all this? I mean?" Sophie took a deep breath, considering the question. "Honestly, it still feels like a dream sometimes. I wake up in the morning hoping to be back on that park bench." She paused, her eyes filling with unshed tears. "But then I hear Noah laughing or see the sun coming through the windows and it's real. It's all real." Alexander nodded, understanding. "What about the job offer? Have you thought about it?" Sophie bit her lip, a habit Alexander had noticed her doing when she was nervous. "I thought about it. A lot. And I'd like to accept." Alexander's face lit up with a genuine smile. "That's wonderful, Sophie. I'm sure you'll be amazing." "But," Sophie continued, her voice firm, "I have a few conditions." Alexander arched an eyebrow. Puzzled, "I'm listening." "First, I want to do it my way. I know your grandmother did big gala events, but I was thinking of something different, something more accessible." Alexander nodded, encouraging her to continue. "And secondly," Sophie took a deep breath, as if gathering her courage, "I want to go back to painting. Not just as a hobby, but as part of the job. Maybe we can organize exhibitions for emerging artists, workshops for children, use art to make a difference in the community." For a moment, Alexander was silent, and Sophie feared she had asked too much. But then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. "Sophie," he said, his voice charged with emotion, "this is perfect. It's exactly the kind of thing my grandmother would have loved." Relief flooded Sophie, and she felt as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Really? You don't think it's too ambitious?" Alexander laughed, a rich, genuine sound that Sophie realized she was hearing more and more often. "Sophie, I've built a financial empire from scratch. Ambition is something I understand and admire." At that moment, Noah let out a joyful cry, catching both their attention. The little one had managed to stack a few blocks of wood and looked extremely pleased with himself. "Look at that," Alexander commented, his eyes twinkling. "We seem to have another builder in the family." The word family hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Sophie felt her heart race and saw something flash through Alexander's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or realization. The rest of the afternoon passed in a comfortable blur of laughter, plans, and shared dreams. As the sun began to set, painting the New York sky in shades of orange and pink, Sophie found herself reluctant to see Alexander leave. "Could you stay for dinner?" she heard herself asking, surprising herself as much as him. Alexander seemed momentarily speechless, a rarity for the eloquent businessman. "I would love to," he finally replied, his smile lighting up his whole face. As Sophie moved around the kitchen, preparing a simple meal, she couldn't help but reflect on how her life had changed in such a short time. From a cold park bench to a welcoming home, from hopelessness to endless possibilities. And at the center of it all, a man she had barely known for a few weeks, but who had somehow become an essential part of her life. Alexander, for his part, watched Sophie and Noah with a growing sense of belonging. For the first time in years, the emptiness he had carried with him seemed to be filling up. It was as if, by helping Sophie and Noah, he was somehow saving himself too. When they finally sat down to dinner, Noah safe in his high chair between them, there was a palpable sense of something new being born. Not just a new chapter in their individual lives, but perhaps the start of a completely new story, one they would write together. As the evening progressed and the conversation flowed easily between them, punctuated by Noah's happy twitterings, both Sophie and Alexander felt a growing certainty. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, as a family. Autumn arrived in New York, painting Central Park in shades of red and gold. Sophie watched the changing seasons from her studio window, her brush dancing across the canvas in front of her. The last few months had been a transformation not only for nature, but for her too. The apartment, once a symbol of her new life, was now truly a home. The once bare walls were now decorated with Sophie's paintings and Noah's colorful drawings. The smell of fresh paint mingled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, creating an atmosphere that screamed home in every corner. Sophie was so absorbed in her painting that she didn't hear the door open. It was only when she felt a gentle hand on her shoulder that she turned around, startled. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you," Alexander said, his warm smile lighting up his eyes. Sophie smiled back, feeling the familiar warmth spread through her chest. "It's all right, I got a bit lost here." Alexander studied the screen with admiration. It was a scene from the park, vibrant and full of life. "It's beautiful, Sophie. You really have a gift." She blushed at the compliment, still not entirely used to receiving them. "Thank you. It's for the exhibition next month. I still can't believe we're actually doing this." The community art exhibition Sophie had proposed was becoming a reality. The building's ballroom, previously only used for exclusive gala events, would be transformed into an accessible gallery, showcasing work by local artists and offering workshops for neighborhood children. "It's going to be amazing," Alexander assured us. "You've worked hard for it." Sophie nodded, a mixture of pride and nervousness on her face. "And Noah? Where is he?" "Sleeping like a little angel," Alexander replied. "We read him 3 stories before he finally fell asleep." Sophie laughed softly. "He's got you in the palm of his hand, doesn't he?" Alexander shrugged, a playful smile on his lips. "Guilty." The moment of levity was interrupted by the shrill ringing of Sophie's phone. She frowned, not recognizing the number. "Hello?" she answered, hesitantly. The color left her face as she heard the voice on the other end of the line. Alexander watched, concerned, as she mumbled monosyllabic replies before finally hanging up. "Sophie? What's wrong?" he asked, the concern evident in his voice. Sophie turned to him, her eyes watering. It was the social worker. "Jack, he's looking for me. He wants custody of Noah." Alexander's blood ran cold. Over the last few months, Jack's shadow had diminished, but never completely disappeared. Now, It threatened to swallow up everything they had built. "He can't do this," Alexander said firmly, pulling Sophie into a hug. "I won't let him." Sophie clung to him, the tears finally falling. What if he succeeds? What if he takes Noah? Alexander held her face between his hands, his gaze intense. "Listen to me, Sophie. I won't let that happen. We have the best lawyers, all the evidence of the abuse. We're going to fight it." Sophie nodded slowly, trying to believe his words. "But what if it's not enough? What if—" "Don't think like that," Alexander interrupted her gently. "One step at a time, okay? Tomorrow we'll talk to the lawyers and work out a plan." That night, after Sophie finally fell asleep, exhausted by stress and tears, Alexander lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The thought of losing Sophie and Noah was unbearable. In just a few months, they had become his family, filling a void he hadn't even known existed. The next morning, while Sophie fed Noah, Alexander made a few phone calls. When he finished, his face was serious but determined. "Sophie," he said, taking a seat at the kitchen table, "I've spoken to our legal team. They think we have a strong case, but—" "But what?" Sophie asked, anxiety clear in her voice. Alexander took a deep breath. "They suggested it would be stronger if we were married." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "Married?" she finally managed to say. Alexander nodded, his face a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "I know it's sudden, and I completely understand if you don't want to, but legally, it would give us an advantage. It would show stability, a solid family environment for Noah." Sophie was silent for a long moment, processing the information. Part of her wanted to shout yes immediately. After all, wasn't that how she felt about Alexander? But another part, the part that still bore the scars of her relationship with Jack, hesitated. "Alexander, I don't know what to say," she finally replied. "It's such a big decision." He took her hands in his gaze intense. "Sophie, I want you to know that this isn't just about Noah or the case. Over the last few months, you and Noah have become my family. I love you, Sophie. I love you both, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you, no matter what." The tears were running freely down Sophie's face now. "I love you too," she whispered. "But I'm scared. What if I screw up again?" Alexander pulled her close, hugging her and Noah. "Let's not screw it up. We'll face it together, as a family. What do you say?" Sophie looked at Noah, who was smiling innocently, oblivious to the whirlwind of emotions around him. Then she looked back at Alexander, seeing in him all the love and security she had always longed for. "Yes," she finally said, a smile spreading across her face despite the tears. "Let's get married." As they embraced, Noah between them, the future seemed uncertain. The custody battle would be difficult, and the sudden marriage would bring its own challenges. But at that moment, in the midst of the chaos, there was one certainty: they would face everything together as a family. The autumn sun streamed in through the kitchen window, bathing the scene in golden light. It was the start of a new chapter, full of promise and challenges. But with love as their foundation, Sophie, Alexander, and Noah were ready to face any storm that came their way. Fall in New York passed in a flurry of golden leaves and frantic preparations. The apartment, once a sanctuary of tranquility, was now buzzing with the energy of an impending wedding and the tension of a legal battle about to begin. Sophie was in the kitchen, leafing through flower catalogs while trying to calm a particularly agitated Noah. Alexander walked in, cell phone pressed to his ear, his voice a low, strained whisper. "Yes, I understand. No, we don't want to go public with this yet. Keep me informed of any movement." He hung up, running his hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration that Sophie had learned to recognize. "What's new?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm for Noah's sake. Alexander sighed, taking Noah from Sophie's arms. The baby immediately calmed down, snuggling into the chest of the man who had become his father in every way, except the biological one. Jack has officially filed for custody, Alexander said, his soft tone contrasting with the gravity of his words. Our lawyers are preparing to contest it, but what? Sophie pressed, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. He's claiming that our marriage is a fraud, an attempt to manipulate the judicial system. Sophie felt as if she'd been punched. But it's not. We love each other. This is real. Alexander pulled her close, forming a familiar embrace with Noah between them. I know, my love. We know. And we're going to prove it. The silence that followed was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. Sophie and Alexander exchanged confused glances. They weren't expecting anyone. Alexander went to the door, still carrying Noah. When he opened it, he saw a middle-aged woman with gray hair and a penetrating gaze. Mr. Rothschild? She asked, her voice firm. Yes, it's me, Alexander replied cautiously. I'm Margaret Foster from Social Services. I'm here for an unscheduled assessment visit. Sophie's heart raced. She knew it would happen eventually, but the reality of the situation hit her full force. Please come in, Alexander said, maintaining his composure. We were just discussing the preparations for our wedding. Margaret entered, her attentive eyes absorbing every detail of the apartment. Sophie quickly began tidying up the scattered catalogs, feeling strangely exposed. So, Margaret began, taking a seat on the sofa. Tell me about how you met. Sophie and Alexander exchanged glances. This was the moment they had rehearsed, but suddenly the words seemed to slip out. It was in the park, Sophie began, her voice shaky. I saw her crying on a bench, Alexander interrupted softly, taking Sophie's hand. With Noah in her arms, I couldn't just pass by without doing anything. As they recounted their story, the breakfast, the offer of the apartment, the months of living together and their growing love, Sophie felt tears forming in her eyes. They weren't tears of fear or sadness, but of gratitude and deep love for the man by her side. Margaret listened attentively, taking occasional notes. Her face remained impassive, giving little indication of her thoughts. Mr. Rothschild, she finally said, I understand that you are not Noah's biological father. How do you see your role in his life? Alexander looked down at the baby in his arms, who was now playing contentedly with his tie. Noah is my son, he said simply, his voice laden with emotion. Perhaps not by blood, but by choice, by love. I've loved him as my own since the first moment I saw him. Sophie couldn't hold back a sob, Alexander's words echoing in her heart. Margaret nodded slowly. What about the wedding? It's a rather sudden decision, considering the circumstances. It was Sophie who answered this time, her voice gaining strength. It may seem sudden to outsiders, but for us, it's as if we've been preparing for this from day one. Alexander isn't just the man I love. He's my best friend, my partner, the father of my child. Marrying him is the most natural thing in the world. A small smile appeared on Margaret's face, the first since she had arrived. I see, she said softly. Well, I think I've seen enough for today. I'll be in touch to arrange another visit soon. After Margaret left, Sophie and Alexander remained silent for a moment, processing what had happened. Do you think it went well? Sophie finally asked, the anxiety evident in her voice. Alexander pulled her close, kissing her forehead. I think it was us, and that's all we can be. That night, after Noah had fallen asleep, Sophie found Alexander on the balcony, looking out at the city lights. What are you thinking about? She asked, wrapping her arms around his waist. He turned around, his eyes shining with an intensity that made Sophie's heart skip a beat. I was thinking about how my life has changed since that morning in the park, how empty I was before you. Sophie felt the tears forming again. Alexander. No, let me finish, he said softly. Sophie, I know that this marriage began as a legal strategy, but I want you to know that, for me, it's much more than that. It's the promise of a life together, of a family. It's the commitment to love you and Noah every day, no matter what. Sophie couldn't hold back the tears now. For me too, she whispered. You and Noah are my whole world. They kissed under the New York stars, the love between them as palpable as the air they breathed. The future was still uncertain, Noah's custody battle just beginning. But at that moment, embraced on the balcony of the apartment that had become their home, Sophie and Alexander knew they could face anything, together. As the night wore on, they remained there, planning their future, dreaming of their wedding day and imagining the life they would build together. And somewhere in the apartment, Noah slept peacefully, secure in the love of his parents, a family united not by blood, but by choice, and by a love stronger than any adversity. The day dawned clear and fresh in New York, the winter sun casting a golden light over the city. In her apartment on East 78th Street, Sophie woke up with her heart racing. Today was the day she and Alexander would officially become a family in the eyes of the law and the world. She got up quietly, careful not to wake Noah, who was sleeping peacefully in his crib. Alexander had spent the night in a nearby hotel, insisting on at least maintaining this tradition. As Sophie got ready, helped by her friend and makeup artist Rachel, her thoughts wandered between the joy of the moment and apprehension about what was still to come. Noah's custody battle loomed like a dark cloud on the horizon of her happiness. "Hey, come back here," Rachel said softly, noticing Sophie's distant gaze. "Today is your day. Focus on love, on now." Sophie smiled, grateful for Rachel's friendship. "You're right. It's just—" "I know," Rachel interrupted her gently. "But look at you. You look radiant. Alexander won't know what hit him." Sophie's dress was simple but elegant, an ivory silk dress that hugged her curves gently before opening into a flowing skirt. Her hair was tied up in a loose bun, with a few strands framing her face. A soft knock on the door announced the arrival of Evelyn, the building's housekeeper, who had become an almost grandmotherly figure to Noah. "Oh, dear," Evelyn sighed when she saw Sophie. "You look absolutely stunning." Sophie felt tears forming, but Rachel quickly intervened. "Don't even think about it. I'm not redoing that makeup." The three women laughed, the tension of the moment dissipating a little. "Is Noah still asleep?" Evelyn asked. As if she had heard his name, a small cry came from the next room. Sophie tried to go, but Evelyn stopped her. "I'll take care of him, darling. You finish getting ready." As Evelyn left with Noah, now awake and babbling happily, Sophie found herself alone for a moment. She walked over to the window, looking out at the city. Somewhere, Alexander was getting ready too. Her heart filled with love at the thought of him. The sound of his phone brought her out of her reverie. It was his lawyer. "Sophie, we've got some news. Jack filed an injunction to stop the wedding." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Can he do that?" "He can try," the lawyer replied, his voice firm. "But don't worry, we're already contesting it. The wedding will happen, Sophie. I just wanted you to be aware of the situation." After hanging up, Sophie sat on the edge of the bed, trembling slightly. Part of her wanted to scream with frustration. Why couldn't Jack just leave them alone? But then the sound of Noah's laughter reached her ears, and with it, a wave of determination. It didn't matter what Jack did. Today, she and Alexander would become an official family. Nothing could take that away from them. With renewed strength, Sophie finished getting ready. The building's ballroom had been transformed into a winter fairy tale setting. White flowers and crystals decorated the space, creating an ethereal and romantic atmosphere. Alexander was standing at the makeshift altar, his dark suit contrasting with the light decoration. His eyes kept on the door, anxious to see Sophie. When the music started and the doors opened, Alexander felt the air leave his lungs. Sophie was a vision, walking towards him with Noah in her arms. The baby was adorable in his little tuxedo, smiling and waving at the guests. When Sophie reached the altar, Alexander took her free hand, his eyes shining with restrained tears. "You look absolutely stunning," he whispered. "You two don't look bad either," Sophie replied with a shaky smile. The celebrant began the ceremony, but for Sophie and Alexander, the world seemed to have shrunk to just the three of them. The words of love and commitment flowed naturally from deep within their hearts. "Sophie," Alexander began his vows, his voice tinged with emotion. "Before you and Noah came into my life, I was an incomplete man. I lived in a world of numbers and business, without realizing the emptiness in my heart. You have taught me the true meaning of family, of unconditional love. I promise to love you both every day of my life, to be the husband and father you deserve." Noah. He turned to the baby, who was staring at him with wide eyes. "I promise to always be your safe haven, your guide, and your biggest supporter. You are my home, my family, my everything." Sophie fought back tears as she began her own vows. "Alexander, you came into our lives like a guardian angel, saving us not only from difficult circumstances, but also from a future without true love. You gave us a home, security, but above all, you gave us your heart. I promise to honor that gift every day, to be your partner, your confidant, your best friend. Together, the three of us, we are stronger than any adversity. I love you, we love you, and I can't wait to build our life together." There wasn't a dry eye in the hall when they exchanged rings. Their "I do" echoed with unshakable certainty. "By the power vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss the bride." Alexander pulled Sophie close, Noah still in her arms, and kissed her with all the love he felt. The applause and cheers from the guests seemed distant compared to the feeling of completeness that enveloped them. The reception that followed was a celebration of love and family. Friends, colleagues, and even Margaret Foster, the social worker, turned up to witness Sophie and Alexander's union. As they danced their first dance as a couple, Noah held between them. Alexander whispered in Sophie's ear, "No matter what happens, the three of us are a family now. Forever." Sophie nodded, tears of happiness in her eyes. "Forever," she repeated. The evening progressed, full of laughter, dancing, and celebration. But for Sophie and Alexander, the most precious moments were those when they were together, with Noah, feeling the love that united them. When they finally retired to their bridal suite, Noah asleep in his portable crib, Sophie and Alexander hugged each other, exhausted but incredibly happy. "Mrs. Rothschild," Alexander murmured, kissing Sophie's forehead. I like the sound of that," Sophie replied with a sleepy smile. As they fell asleep in each other's arms, they both knew that, no matter what the future held, they would face it together. Noah's custody battle wasn't over yet. But that night, at that moment, they were simply a family united by the purest and truest love. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But for now, Sophie, Alexander, and Noah slept peacefully, wrapped in the warmth of their love and the promise of a future together. Spring had arrived in New York, bringing with it not only the rebirth of nature, but also the promise of new beginnings. The family court was silent that morning, the tension palpable in the air as Sophie and Alexander Rothschild awaited the final verdict on Noah's custody. Sophie held Alexander's hand tightly, her eyes fixed on the door through which the judge would emerge at any moment. Noah, now almost 2, played quietly at her feet, oblivious to the gravity of the moment that would define his future. "It's going to be okay," Alexander murmured, although his voice betrayed a slight tremble. "We're a family. Nothing can change that." Sophie nodded, unable to form words. The last few months had been an emotional roller coaster. The happiness of their marriage mixed with the constant anxiety of the legal battle. Jack had fought tooth and nail, using every tactic possible to try and discredit Sophie and Alexander. The door opened and everyone stood up. Judge Thompson, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, took his seat. After careful consideration of all the evidence presented, the judge began, his voice resonating in the silent room. "This court has reached a decision in the custody case of the minor Noah Parker." Sophie felt her heart stop for a moment. Her whole life, all her dreams for the future, depended on the next words. Full and permanent custody of Noah Parker is granted to Sophie and Alexander Rothschild. The world seemed to stop for an instant. Sophie heard a distant sound, like a muffled sob, and realized it was coming from herself. Alexander wrapped his arms around her, silent tears streaming down his face. Furthermore, the judge continued, Alexander Rothschild's application for adoption is approved. As of this moment, Noah is legally and officially Noah Rothschild. The room erupted in restrained applause. Margaret Foster, the social worker who had followed the case from the beginning, smiled openly from the back of the room. Sophie bent down, took Noah in her arms and hugged him tightly. "It's over, my love," she whispered. "We're home." Alexander joined in the hug, enveloping his family. "We're the Rothschilds now," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. "All of us." As they left the courthouse, a familiar figure was waiting for them on the steps. Jack, Sophie's ex and Noah's biological father, was standing there, his face a mixture of conflicting emotions. Sophie felt Alexander stiffen beside her, but she put a hand on his arm, silently pleading for calm. "Jack," she said, her voice firm. "Sophie," he replied, his eyes moving to Noah. I just wanted to say that I understand the judge's decision, and I'm sorry for everything." Sophie nodded slowly. "Thank you, Jack. I hope you find peace." Jack looked at Alexander, then back at Sophie and Noah. "You seem happy, a real family." "We are," Alexander replied, his voice surprisingly gentle. Jack nodded one last time before turning and leaving, his solitary figure disappearing into the New York crowd. Months passed, and life in the Rothschild penthouse had found a new rhythm. Sophie's community art gallery was a success, bringing color and creativity to the neighborhood. Alexander had reduced his working hours, prioritizing time with his family. One sunny Sunday afternoon, they were in the park, in the same spot where it had all begun. Noah was happily chasing soap bubbles, his laughter echoing in the air. "Who knew," Sophie said softly, leaning against Alexander's shoulder, that day in the park would change our lives forever?" Alexander smiled, kissing the top of her head. "The best investment I've ever made?" Sophie laughed, giving his arm a playful pat. "Always the businessman." "Hey, I can't help it," he replied with a mischievous grin. "But seriously, Sophie, thank you." She turned to look at him, confused. "For what?" "For giving me a family, for teaching me the true meaning of love and home." Her eyes shone with restrained emotion. "You and Noah, you are everything to me." Sophie felt tears forming. Even after all this time, the love she felt for Alexander surprised her with its intensity. "Thank you, my love, for saving us, for loving us." Noah came running back, throwing himself into his parents' arms. "Mom, Daddy, look, butterfly." They followed their son's excited gaze, spotting a delicate blue butterfly perched on a nearby flower. "It's beautiful, Noah," Sophie said, smiling. "Just like our family," Alexander added, hugging them both. As they watched the butterfly take flight, Sophie reflected on her journey. From the depths of despair to the heights of happiness. She looked at her husband, at her son, and knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world. There, on that park bench, surrounded by the hustle and bustle of the city that never sleeps, Sophie, Alexander, and Noah were more than just three people. They were a living testimony to the power of love, compassion, and chosen family. And as the sun set over New York, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the Rothschild family walked back home, their hearts filled with love and gratitude for the miracle they had found in each other.